go!
There's a start line and a flying finish line that can be anywhere from 1 kilometer to 60 kilometers long, and that's when you're racing flat out in 1 minute intervals.
In fact, we have customers out there who wouldn't be seen going into a North American dealership.
Motoring 92 is brought to you by Quaker State. Quaker State, one tough motor oil.
This week we're in the state of Tennessee, and we're at the Loveless Cafe just outside of Nashville. Now this cafe is rather famous here in Tennessee, and we'll tell you why at the end of the program. Also later, we're going to visit the town of Spring Hill, Tennessee, site of North America's newest car assembly plant, a plant that has received its share of publicity and controversy, and we'll find out why later on. But first, we're going to join Steve Grant. Steve recently found himself at a car rally, and as you're about to see, Steve got himself rather close to the action.
This is the 8th year for the Georgian Trials, but this year there are a couple of variables thrown in. Number one, it's raining, which should make for some very interesting driving conditions. And speaking of interesting, I get to be a co-driver. Now, I've never done this before. Luckily, I'm with the Canadian champion. Tom McGeer drives this 1979 RX-7. His co-driver, Trish Sparrow, has given me her seat for the day, so I have some pretty big shoes to fill because she is the Canadian Female Driver of the Year, along with being the co-driver of the year, so this should be interesting.
Actually, I'm getting a little ahead of myself here. Besides, I was really excited about my first opportunity to co-drive, but I quickly recognized that a lot of preparation was needed. Thankfully, Trish Sparrow was a great teacher.
When you see this board in yellow, Tom will stop automatically, and he'll ask you, what time are we in? And you'll tell him we're in at 1:24. When 1:24 comes up on your watch, then you pull into this board in red. The co-driver really has two main functions. One is to keep the driver on time. You have to do all of the route timing, make sure you're checking in at the proper intervals. And two is to give proper directions. When you're on a stage and you're actually competing against the clock, you have to make sure that you're calling out corners at least 200 meters before you get there. That way your driver can set the car up and be in the right frame before you enter the corner. Okay, the stages are the actual speed portions of the event. There's a start line and a flying finish line. They can be anywhere from 1 kilometer to 60 kilometers long, and that's when you're racing flat out in 1 minute intervals. Transits are just driving in between the stages, so you're on public roads driving at the speed limit, and that's why the car has to be road legal. You wouldn't hear anything until, as I said, usually 200 to 300 meters before the corner, and then you would hear sort of 200 T right or 200 hard left. You usually put an inflection on the word if it's a really difficult turn. For example, if it's a caution, you would really emphasize caution and then followed by which direction you're going.
But I'm with the Canadian champion, so if I screw up, it's...
He'll cover for you.
That's what I was worried about.
The top one is the same thing. There's a hole back there. It's a bit hard to see. You sort of got to feel for it. And then you just use this to pop it in.
Why do I have a feeling, Tom, I'm going to be real stiff tomorrow?
Yeah. Oh, not to worry. Just a few extra precautions just in case. We want to keep it safe.
Well, now that my dry land training was over, it was time to learn about my actual responsibilities in the car.
Oil pressure gauge, oil temperature gauge, and water temperature gauge. You're basically responsible for watching those during the stage. Make sure that they don't go over their limits. Looking about 220 on the water and 240 on the oil temperature, and about a minimum of about 50 pounds of oil pressure. If they start to drop below that, you can bring that to my attention, and we'll slow down a little bit.
Are we going to be talking much during this, or basically I'm just giving you instructions as we go along?
You'll basically be giving me instructions. I might ask for clarification. If you, for example, see the temperature getting too hot, you can mention it and we can discuss, we might discuss what the temperature is and what the pressure is, just to make sure. Obviously the helmet intercoms make that communication a lot easier, back and forth. The main thing you're responsible for is the odometer. That's this device right here. You have two digital readouts that you're going to be reading off every 100 meters, it clicks over. And as the car travels sideways around the corners, I end up looking from about here all the way around to here, and as we swing back and forth. But I'm mostly concentrating on that area, and I'll occasionally glance down at the tachometer and the oil pressure and temperature as my eyes sort of go over that way. But if we break a line, an oil pressure line, say, and I happen to be looking out the other side, another set of eyes watching those gauges can save a very expensive engine rebuild.
Halfway through the drivers' meeting, I was finally beginning to feel confident about this whole thing. Dennis Wharton really added to my confidence.
Well, I can guarantee you're never going to forget it. I'm hoping this is an experience that you're going to go back and say, hey, I'm glad I really had a chance to do it. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, go!
Finally, the build-up was over and the race was on. As eager spectators searched for a good vantage point, Tom and I went zooming by. Did you miss it? Well, you better look again because it never happened again. Now, I could tell you that we zoomed off the road at about 90 miles per hour, but unfortunately there were no cameras available to back up my story. Actually, it wasn't really that dramatic, but it did finish our race.
No, I lost control of the car. The steering wheel got out of my hands going around a corner, and we went off into the woods, got hung up in the swamp, couldn't get out.
Well, as the shirt says, Lassie doesn't cover road.
During the pylon test, the Tempo tracked a surprisingly true line for a nose-heavy car. Only when pushed hard did any degree of understeer develop.
Test Drive with Graham Fletcher.
This week on Test Drive, we look at the 1992 Ford Tempo. Now, in previous years, the knock against this car has been a dreadful lack of power. Thanks to a new V6 option, that should no longer be a concern.
The Tempo suspension is fully independent, featuring nitrogen gas pressurized struts and hefty sway bars both front and rear. The sporty nature of the suspension means the ride is on the firm side, but in keeping with the theme of the GLS model. During the pylon test, the Tempo tracked a surprisingly true line for a nose-heavy car. Only when pushed hard did any degree of understeer develop, a true testament to the suspension and low-profile Firestone Firehawk radials. Body roll is equally well controlled, with the car feeling sure-footed for the most part. Only on washboard-type tarmac did the whole thing begin to feel a little jittery. The tyres also thump quite loudly over expansion joints. The instrumentation is analog in configuration and provides the driver with sufficient information that is easily retrieved. The remainder of the dash is well laid out with only a couple of minor quibbles. As far as the climate controls are concerned, the fan switch is set in a different plane from the temperature and direction controls. Also, the rotary wiper controls located on the side of the instrument housing is not as easy or convenient to use as the more popular stalk type. Minor complaints in themselves, but cumulatively they make life unnecessarily difficult. Overall, the fit and finish is quite good, the exception being the defroster vents. They look as though someone used a hacksaw to cut the final hole. The driving position is good, with the front seats providing the required level of comfort and support despite their rather flat appearance. Accessing the rear seat in the two-door model requires a fair amount of agility. Once back there though, the amount of head and legroom is generous and the seating is comfortable. The trunk is positively huge. It is also well laid out, although the liftover could do with being a little lower.
This 3-litre V6 is what differentiates the 1992 Tempo from previous years. Prior to this year, you could only get a 4-banger. Now, the knock against that is the fact that the immediate competition for this car, being the Chev Cavalier, has offered a 6 for a number of years. Tempo's new 3-litre V6 offers sequential multi-port fuel injection as well as 140 horses. This ensures a very good power-to-weight ratio.
On the skid pad, the Tempo turned in 0 to 100k times of a titch over 9 seconds. Matched with this engine is a close ratio 5-speed manual transmission. The gate is, for a North American car at least, surprisingly clean and crisp, and the clutch, despite its long travel, is progressive with the bite point easy to find. Around town, the close ratio gearbox requires a lot of shifting, partly because of the short ratios and partly because of the amount of engine noise, encourages you to upshift to a higher gear where the engine noise settles down to an acceptable level. Some additional sound insulation probably wouldn't hurt. Stopping power is supplied by a conventional power-assisted front disc rear drum setup. During the brake test, we averaged stopping distances of 122 feet from 80k. A point that is sure to haunt Ford is the lack of ABS, even as an option. Prior to the 92 model year, it probably wouldn't have mattered. At the moment, it certainly does, because the Chev Cavalier offers ABS as a standard item. My pet peeve on the Tempo is a relatively simple one. When you apply the parking brake on a grade, the headlights go out. The net result is that in traffic you end up flashing erroneous signals to oncoming traffic. Anyway, now to the scoreboard for a rundown on the 1992 Ford Tempo. As I indicated, the suspension is on the firm side. This and the excellent rubber give the Tempo surprisingly good handling characteristics. It by far and away exceeded my expectations in the pylon test. The extra cylinders and abundance of horsepower and torque provide plenty of power. If the transmission were the equal of the engine, we would have been able to better the 9 seconds we required to reach the 100k mark. No sooner you're into first gear when you're forced out of it. A rethink of the ratios would be really nice. The power-assisted disc drum setup provided good stops averaging just 122 feet from 80k. The lack of an ABS feature is going to hurt sales though. Let's hope when the redesigned Tempo appears, this situation has been addressed. The level of comfort provided is fairly good despite the firm suspension. Wind noise has been kept to a minimum and the engine noise only intrudes in the first 3 gears. We averaged a commendable 10 litres per 100 kilometres or 28 miles per gallon, a pleasant surprise given the performance. Despite my criticisms, the 92 Tempo is a nice little car. The addition of the V6 is particularly welcome and now puts it on an even footing with most of the competition. Tempo has been the best-selling car in Canada, and with some revisions it's ready to regain that mantle.
You're looking at one of the oldest buildings in Nashville. That's Union Station. Used to be a train station, now it's a hotel. All right, we're going to join Bill Gardner in just a moment, but first, I've got something for you Elvis fans. Earlier, we were in a car museum here in Nashville, and we saw a car that was owned by Elvis. As a matter of fact, this 76 Eldorado was one of 3 Cadillacs that Elvis purchased about 2 o'clock in the morning following a concert. They even have a copy of the check he wrote for just over $44,000. All right, let's now head to the garage and join an Elvis fan, our very own Bill Gardner.
How do you know when your wheels need rebalancing? Well, the most obvious thing you're going to notice is probably some vibration feedback, maybe through the steering wheel, the seats, or some other part of the body of the vehicle. And if you notice that vibration, it may be time to go out to the wheel and tire assemblies and have a look and see if rebalancing is required. Now, you may not be able to see anything visually, but it's certainly a prerequisite before you start trying to balance wheels and tires, because you can't balance tires that are lumpy, have bulges in them, bent wheels, etc. Now, back when wheel and tire assemblies were basically tall and skinny, static balancing would do the job just fine. But on today's vehicles, as we get wider and wider wheel and tire assemblies, dynamic balancing is necessary. And in order to illustrate dynamic imbalance, one of the best ways we can illustrate it is to use, for example, this roll of duct tape. If you can imagine several ounces of imbalance right here, as this gets to the top of the wheel, it'll try and push the wheel inward, because if you remember a weight hanging on a piece of string, the faster you spin it, the more it tries to climb out at 90 degrees to the axis you're spinning it from. So as that gets to the top, it'll try and push that wheel in towards the center. As that same imbalance gets to the bottom, it'll try and do that to the wheel. It'll push the bottom in and the top will come out. As it comes back around to the top like this. So that wheel will end up going down the road something like this, sort of barrel rolling, okay? And that's what we refer to as dynamic imbalance. And in order to offset that, we clip lead wheel weights on various locations around the wheel using a wheel balancing apparatus, which is usually done off the car. The whole wheel and tire assembly is mounted on the machine to balance it. Before we do anything like that, it's important to pick up each axle of the vehicle, give the tire and wheel assembly a spin, and make sure that it turns nice and true. There's no lumps or bulges in the tire, uneven wear, or any roughness on the tire. And also there's no bends in the wheel rim. If that wheel rim is running out excessively, we'll never be able to balance that properly. We'll still have that little vibration kick or feedback through the steering wheel. So it's very important to check that before we waste our time and money trying to balance something like that. Now, on many of today's cars that have wide wheels and tires, another important prerequisite is to check that the wheel is clean on the inside, because as you can see, this wheel is quite deep and flat in here, and it will tend, as it's spinning, it'll tend to gather debris in this area, and that debris can be quite heavy. In some cases, there's grease fittings in this area, and they dribble a bit of grease. It gets on the inside of the wheel, and then it cakes all kinds of mud and stones in there, and that can throw the wheel significantly out of balance. So before you try balancing them, make sure that you clean that area very well. And the wider the wheel, or if you're driving on secondary roads, a lot of mud or even snow can cake in there and throw those wheels out of balance. So before you try and balance them, check that out first and clean them if there's any debris in there. Till next week, I'm Bill Gardner for Motoring 92.
One of the pure intents of Saturn is to attract import-intended buyers, which is to say, how do we get them into the Saturn retail outlet?
If you have any comments or suggestions, drop us a line at Motoring 92, Post Office Box 284, Station J, Toronto, Ontario, M4J 4Y1.
You are looking at an automobile assembly plant. This plant is producing a car they call the Saturn, which recently made its debut in Canada. Now, this plant is located in Spring Hill, Tennessee, just outside of Nashville. Now, at first glance, it looks like an average plant. Well, it isn't.
Saturn is a division of General Motors. But here's the catch. Although General Motors has completely funded the new facility, the Saturn was designed from scratch independent of GM's other divisions. And the Saturn will not include the GM nameplate. In fact, General Motors does not want consumers to consider Saturn a GM car.
The distancing that you refer to, Brad, of General Motors and Saturn is not one of we don't want to have anything to do with General Motors, because we've had an enormous amount to do, and there is a lot of cross-transactional activities that take place between the two of us. From a perspective of the customer in the marketplace, we recognized at the onset that there is a large sector of the marketplace who are not happy with a domestic manufactured product because of their past experience, and General Motors is included in that. In fact, we have customers out there who wouldn't be seen going into a North American dealership. And so in order to backstep away from that and attract that customer, because one of the pure intents of Saturn is to attract import-intended buyers.
We pretty well have come to a conclusion that there's about a third of the market that is primarily an import-oriented market buyer today, and another third of the market is somewhere in between a domestic and an import, haven't quite made up their mind, and the other third is still very totally committed to domestic nameplates.
The market is really all of the imports, but the market's the Honda Civic, the Toyota Corolla. We're seeing some experience in the U.S. where some of the trade-ins are Camrys and Accords, and so that whole end of the market, first-time buyers.
I'm now at the local car wash in Spring Hill, Tennessee. This town has a population of about 1,800. Now, you can imagine the excitement here in town when it was learned that General Motors was about to build the Saturn plant. I mean, think of all those job opportunities. Well, it didn't quite work out that way.
In fact, of the 5,000 employees at the Spring Hill plant, only 500 came from the local area, and they were eligible only for non-unionized positions.
We explained that we've got a large corporation with like 40,000 people laid off. It's an obligation to General Motors to be sure those people get jobs, and so obviously we offer those people the jobs here in Spring Hill.
We understood it, that they was going to give job opportunities to people around here. And I might know of 1 or 2 people personally that works there. You know, but you know, I understand them closing down the plants up north and moving them down here. Them people need work too. But you know, like I said, you know, we couldn't even get a job, you know, when they was building the place.
We'd love to be able to hire folks from the Tennessee area, but at the same time, if I've got someone who's been out of a job, living in Flint, Michigan, and he's been out of a job, his house is being foreclosed on, etc., back in Flint, Michigan, I think I got to do something for him too.
Nothing much has changed. It's unbelievable. If you didn't know the plant was there, you wouldn't know it was there. Some people came in early on, paid kind of a high price for some of the real estate, and they've really gotten burned because they haven't been able to sell it. There was one big development, which was a new town center, which was a city hall and things like that, and that has since gone bankrupt. So there's been no new restaurants, no new convenience stores, nothing new. So Spring Hill has pretty much remained the same.
People from up north come down here, you know, and they might not like the South, you know, and then they might go back and give other people a chance for work.
I think it's been a different kind of experience. Most of us have grown up in the seclusion of a manufacturing organization where we want to do things differently. Now we've got a chance to do it, and I think we're getting a lot more attention than most of us are comfortable with. And I think if we could do something over with, we'd still stay a little more back in the factory and less out on television.
Kenzie's Corner with Jim Kenzie.
You know, they call these things space saver tires, but I don't get it. I mean, the only time having a little tire like this is of any advantage is if your trunk is so full that a real tire wouldn't fit and you also have a flat. But if those two things both happen to you, where do you put the flat tire? It won't fit in the space that this one came from. So what are you going to do? Put it on your mother-in-law's lap? And another thing, speaking of changing tires, how come the car companies always give you these dumb little wrenches about the size of a dinner fork? They have a lousy fit on the lug nut in the first place, and then when you try and take them off, you find some lunatic has reefed them on with a nuclear-powered air gun. This is particularly dangerous because it could leave you stranded at the side of the road if you don't have a big enough wrench to undo those nuts. And what's more, if you've got aluminum road wheels like this car has, over-tightening these lug nuts can permanently damage them, and they're expensive pieces. So next time you see your mechanic working on your wheels, let him use the air wrench to just snug them up gently, but make sure he uses a proper torque wrench to tighten them up properly.
If you ever come to the state of Tennessee, the locals will tell you there's at least one place you have to visit for some real Southern home flavor. Well, I'm at that place. I'm at the Loveless Cafe.
Enjoying your breakfast.
Thank you very much. We're just outside of Nashville, and they tell me people like Jimmy Buffett and Willie Nelson are regulars here, and even this year, Paul McCartney and Princess Anne have been here. And the specialty, you guessed it, Southern fried chicken, country ham, and homemade biscuits. Well, that's it for this week. Now, next week, among other things, Graham Fletcher will be test driving the Saturn. So make sure you join us as we bring you more stories about cars and the people who drive them.
Motoring 92 has been brought to you by Quaker State. Quaker State, one tough motor oil.